Hatred is deep. All right. So this is a story entitled "The Sexual Assault Against Boys is a Crisis." All right. And you can find this one on WashingtonPost.com as well. All right. And the author of the piece, you can see listed there, one Emma Brown, who I think is a single mother, but I don't know. She's a little vague on that. But nevertheless, Xavier Brothers, appreciate that support. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm glad you guys are, can identify it. All right. So nevertheless, she starts this article by talking about, she says, "I'm strong and fearless" is something she teaches her 2-year-old daughter, as her daughter hesitates to play on the playground, is afraid to get involved and engage some of the activities. But then she says, "I had no such pithy motto for my son. Reminding a boy to be strong and fearless seemed unnecessary and maybe even counterproductive, fortifying a stereotype instead of unraveling it. What could I give him to help him ignore the tired old expectations of boys? I had no idea. I didn't know how to help him resist the stresses and stereotypes of boyhood because I had never grappled with the fact that boys face stresses and stereotypes at all." So this is basically a feminist who only came to appreciate the trials of boys because she had a son. And this is often the case. Usually, in respect to the sisters that support my platform, but 9 times out of 10, the sisters that do usually have a son. Or maybe they're caring for a father, but there's usually some kind of male in their lives. It's generally not on principle per se. It's usually because they can actually see the vulnerability in the people they care for, and that kind of creates a shift. And there's nothing wrong with that. I support it. But in regard to this particular person, that was her inroads to actually asking questions about what boys and men deal with. Now, she avoids men for the most part. She deals with boys, and then the story takes a quick left. But I do want to give you some of the data that she presented. Again, the story is interesting, at least in that respect. She said, but in regard to stereotypes, boys, of course, do grapple with them. They learn they're supposed to be tough and strong and sexually dominant, according to a massive study of gender attitudes among 10 to 14-year-old boys in the U.S. Girls learn that they're supposed to be attractive and submissive, right? The global script clearly harms girls who face disproportionate levels of sexual violence. She doesn't know the data. Not to mention greater risk of early pregnancy and leaving school. But Robert Blum, physician who has studied adolescence for 40 years and is one of the Johns Hopkins scholars leading the study, wants people to understand that it also hurts boys. The story about boys is yet to be told, and I think it's really important that we do. Our data suggests that the myth that boys, not black, but the myth that boys are advantaged and girls are disadvantaged simply isn't true, right? The movement for gender equality is often focused on empowering girls, but as Blum sees it, achieving gender equality also requires attention for boys. They too need to know they are not circumscribed by ideas about who and how they should be. Okay. Boys are more likely than girls to die in their second decade of life, and they use more alcohol and tobacco, habits that erode their health as they age, Blum said. But even more troubling, Blum's team found that boys suffered higher levels of physical violence, neglect, and sexual abuse by adults than girls. And the more a boy was victimized, the more likely he was to do violence to others. Those findings should serve as a gut punch. We can't solve the problem of violence against girls and women without also addressing the violence against men and boys. And we won't succeed in teaching our sons to care for other people's bodies until we learn to care for theirs. Many boys are molested by adults. That's true. But there are strong signs that children are even more likely to be sexually abused or sexually assaulted by other children. In one study, 13,000 children aged 17 and younger, 3/4 of the boys who reported being sexually victimized said the person who violated them was another child. And a little more than half of those assaults, the violator was a girl, right? Most boys who had been assaulted had never told an adult. 2015, a national survey by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention found that nearly 4 million men had been victims of sexual violence just in the previous year. More than 2 million of those men were subjected to unwanted sexual contact, and more than 800,000 said they were made to penetrate another person, an awkward term that doesn't show up much in the media or in public debate. It means that a man was either too inebriated to consent or was coerced by or threatened into sex, right? Now, there's 2 parts of what I read that I want you to fixate on for a moment, right? The first one, hold on, where did I put it? I just read it over. All right. So the first one is Blum's team found that boys suffered higher levels of physical violence, neglect, and sexual abuse by adults than girls. I want you to remember that, right? Suffered higher levels of physical violence, neglect, and sexual abuse by adults than girls. More physical violence than girls, right? The second one, right? Should have highlighted it. Okay. So the second one is, in one study, 13,000 children aged 17 and younger, 3/4 of boys who had reportedly been sexually victimized said the person who violated them was another child. And half of those assaults, and a little more than half, the violator was a girl. Now, the reason I highlight those two things is this is a very long article, very long, and there's a lot of good data in it. The majority of the article, however, she does this shift, right? Maybe a third the way through, and spends the majority of the time talking about boys assaulting other boys, which there's nothing wrong with. I appreciate the use of the data, the sharing of the stories, but she fixates on it. Right? And she's talking in particular about instances of what was called brooming, right? Where you have boys who are anally violating other boys with broomsticks, usually as a hazing gesture, right? And she talks about it from high school to college, and she talks about the way the boys experience that. And it is important. Not taking that away. We do have to understand that anything and anyone that violates boys, even when it's other boys, whether it's adults, male, female, it needs attention, especially with boys, because it gets ignored. But my issue was how much time she spent talking about that. And these two instances that I just quoted, where she talks about the abuse that boys experience to a greater degree than girls, and the violation of boys, younger boys, by younger girls, those completely got sidestepped. She mentioned them and kept it pushing and spent the majority of the time talking about how boys violate boys. Now, coming from a feminist standpoint, it's kind of easy to understand why she would do that, because it fits easily within her paradigm. Girls and women fundamentally are victims. They're not aggressors to any great extent. So it's interesting that when she's forcibly introduced to the data, and when I say forced, it's mainly because she has a son she cares about, so she can't dismiss it or walk away from it because she loves her son. So she's kind of forcibly introduced to this data because of her desire to protect her son. She sees it, but then quickly shifts her focus to where boys are violating boys. I see this happen all the time, even in my classroom, right? Because there's a kind of, you got these set of beliefs where women are essentially victims and only victims, and men and boys are essentially aggressors. And even when you're introduced to data that counters that, you have to find new ways to maintain your belief structures and dismiss the new information, even in your attempt to highlight the new information. So I want you to be aware of that. When you see these kind of articles where they kind of cover what's going on with boys and men, especially when you have feminists that are covering it, male or female, try and pay attention to the way the information is presented. What's acknowledged and what's completely dismissed. What's given emphasis and what isn't. And in this instance, especially if you could actually see the length of this article, it'll blow you away as to what kinds of mental gymnastics she does to maintain or to dismiss what's going on, right? So she kind of really sidesteps that. Now, in regard to this particular story, I want you guys to have some additional information that might be of use to you. So a while back, I did this. This is 2016, right? I did what I referred to as the male rape information sheet. It is a one-page PDF, and I'm going to put the link right here in the chat, right, to my Google Drive, and you can go ahead and download it and peruse it yourself, right? And basically, one of the things it shows you by going through the data in a very short one-page dynamic is that when you add up the made to penetrate cases, when you add up the post 2012 FBI's definition of rape, right, which shifts and moves away from female violation as the standard and moves to penetration and a gender neutral kind of language. When you add that to the prison sexual assault and rape statistics, men, statistically black men, are more likely to experience rape and sexual abuse than women. And one of the reasons I can say that is because for a good part, post 2008 to maybe about a year ago, you had incredibly high incarceration rates. I mean, America locks up more of its citizens than any other country, right? And in about 2012, I think you had about over between 800,000 and 900,000 black men incarcerated, right? So when you talk about how many more men are incarcerated by women, you had about 2.2 million men at a certain point in time within the last decade, and about 220,000 women. When you look at the bifurcation of the carceral numbers, one of the things you find is the rates of rape and sexual assault go up considerably for men. But we don't talk about it that way. This is solely the purview of women and girls. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to women and girls, but if you have this population that by nature, or I should say by just, circumstance, are incarcerated to such a greater degree, the numbers are going to go up for that. And when you start to find new modes of sexual assault that haven't really been acknowledged prior to the last decade, like made to penetrate cases, what you start to find is that males actually suffer from this far more than we thought. Right? But you'll find few people that are willing to do the research and publicly state these kind of dynamics to the degree that need to be stated. So look into the male rape information sheet, kind of check out the citations. It's a 2016, so I don't know if the some of the links that I use to cite the data have changed. You can go ahead and look for that best you can. I apologize if that has happened. Like I said, this is about 5 years old, this particular document, but it is a good starting point. And you can delve into the data yourself, right? And look at the vulnerability of boys and men. All right. Let's see.